Let me be direct with you from the outset. What is unfolding in the Red Sea right now is not a piracy crisis. It is not a terrorist disruption. It is not even primarily about Yemen. What we are witnessing is the systematic reconfiguration of global maritime trade routes, and most people watching cable news have absolutely no idea that it is happening. I am looking at shipping data from Lloyd's List Intelligence that has been circulating among maritime insurance analysts for the past 96 hours. What it shows is not a temporary disruption. It is not a security incident that will resolve itself. What it shows is a 67% reduction in container ship traffic through the Bab el Mandeb Strait compared to the same period last year. 67%. That is not an anomaly. That is a structural shift. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why the Red Sea corridor has been functionally closed to Western commercial shipping, why the rerouting around Africa represents the most significant change to global trade patterns since the Suez Crisis of 1956, and why your grocery bill, your heating costs, and the price of virtually everything manufactured in Asia is about to reflect this reality. This is geopolitical analysis that demands your attention. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively studied by European central banks and American logistics companies, and you are not getting this from mainstream media. Let's start with geography, because the Red Sea is not just another waterway. It is one of the most strategically critical maritime choke points on Earth, and understanding why requires looking at the numbers and the economics that make this corridor irreplaceable. The Bab el Mandeb Strait, which connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean, is 29 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. To put that in perspective, the Strait of Hormuz, which everyone talks about, is 33 kilometers wide. The Bab el Mandeb is actually narrower. This means that approximately 12% of global trade by volume and roughly 8% of global liquefied natural gas shipments pass through this single corridor every single day. But those percentages tell only part of the story. According to the International Maritime Organization, prior to November 2023, an average of 97 vessels transited the Bab el Mandeb daily. That included container ships carrying manufactured goods from Asia to Europe, oil tankers moving Middle Eastern crude to European refineries, and bulk carriers transporting grain. The entire European supply chain, particularly for goods originating in China, India, and Southeast Asia, depended on this route functioning smoothly. The economic efficiency of this route is staggering when you examine it closely. A single large container ship, what the industry calls a triple E class vessel, can carry approximately 18,000 20-foot equivalent units. That is 18,000 standard shipping containers. Each of those containers holds an average retail value of $50,000 to $75,000 worth of consumer goods. One ship transiting the Red Sea could be carrying between $900 million and $1 $35 billion worth of cargo. The Suez Canal, which connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, generated $4 billion in revenue for Egypt in 2023. That single waterway represented Egypt's third largest source of foreign currency after remittances and tourism. More than 20,000 vessels transit Suez annually, and the average transit fee for a fully loaded container ship runs between $700,000 and $1 million depending on vessel size. Container shipping through Suez was the fastest route from Asia to Europe, saving approximately 10 days and 3,400 nautical miles compared to the alternative route around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. Now, here is what makes those savings critical. In the shipping industry, time is not just convenience. Time is inventory cost. Time is capital efficiency, and time is competitive advantage. When a container ship spends 10 fewer days at sea, those containers and that vessel become available for the next voyage 10 days sooner. Across a full year, that time savings means a shipping company can complete approximately 15% more voyages with the same fleet. That is pure economic multiplier. For just-in-time manufacturing supply chains, which have dominated global production for the past 30 years, the Red Sea route was not optional. It was foundational. European retailers and manufacturers structured their entire inventory systems around predictable 24-day transit times from Asian factories. Automotive parts, electronics components, seasonal clothing, all of it timed to arrive exactly when needed, minimizing expensive warehouse storage. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. The implications of what I'm about to show you will explain why economists are quietly revising their inflation forecasts and why central banks are more concerned than they are publicly admitting. Now, stay with me because this context is essential. When someone tells you the Red Sea situation is just about Houthi militants firing missiles at ships, they are missing the entire strategic architecture. What we are about to examine is far more complex, and the economic consequences are already showing up in price indexes across Europe and North America. Announcement number one, and this one matters more than the headlines suggest. The Houthi movement in Yemen has deployed a layered anti-ship capability that Western naval forces have been unable to neutralize despite 9 months of sustained operations. According to reporting by Reuters and confirmed by multiple maritime security firms, Houthi forces have conducted over 190 attacks on commercial and military vessels since November 2023. These attacks have employed anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, explosive-laden drone boats, and naval mines. Commander Daniel Hagari, spokesperson for the U.S. Central Command, acknowledged publicly in March 2024 that coalition forces have intercepted hundreds of projectiles, but critically, he also acknowledged that not all threats can be stopped. The weapon systems being deployed are not improvised devices. The anti-ship ballistic missiles being used have been identified by Western intelligence as variants of Iranian Khalij-Fars missiles, with ranges exceeding 300 kilometers and terminal guidance systems. These are not crude Katyusha rockets. These are precision-guided weapons capable of hitting moving ships. Maritime insurance underwriters at Lloyd's of London responded to this threat environment by reclassifying the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden as high-risk waters in December 2023. War risk premiums, which had been running at approximately $20,000 per voyage for a standard container ship, spiked to between $150,000 and $300,000 per transit. For some vessels, insurance became unavailable at any price. Think carefully about what this means. When insurance costs alone add $200,000 to a single voyage, and when that voyage carries the risk of missile strikes that could result in total loss of cargo and vessel, shipping companies make a rational economic calculation. They reroute received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, the Cape Route alternative is not economically equivalent, and this is the part that reshapes global trade. The journey from Shanghai to Rotterdam via the Suez Canal is approximately 10,100 nautical miles and takes roughly 24 days. The journey from Shanghai to Rotterdam via the Cape of Good Hope is approximately 13,500 nautical miles and takes 34 to 36 days. That is an additional 3,400 nautical miles and 10 to 12 extra days at sea. According to analysis by the shipping consultancy Drewry, the additional fuel cost for the Cape route run approximately $500,000 per voyage for a large container ship. That is pure fuel cost, not including the opportunity cost of having vessels and containers tied up for an additional 10 days, which reduces the effective capacity of the global container fleet by roughly 15%. Maersk, the world's second-largest container shipping company, announced in January 2024 that it was suspending all Red Sea transits indefinitely and rerouting via the Cape. Mediterranean Shipping Company, the world's largest container line, made the same announcement. Hapag-Lloyd, CMA CGM, and virtually every major carrier followed within weeks. Bloomberg reported in February that container shipping capacity between Asia and Europe had effectively contracted by 12% despite no reduction in the number of active vessels. Ships were simply spending more time at sea and delivering fewer voyages per year. The impact on freight rates was immediate. The Shanghai Containerized Freight Index, which measures the cost of shipping a standard 40-foot container from China to Europe, rose from $1,400 in November 2023 to $4,200 by March 2024. That is a 200% increase in 4 months. Now, here is what makes this critical. Those increased freight costs do not remain with shipping companies. They flow directly through to retail prices. A typical container holds approximately 8,000 pairs of shoes, or 1,500 laptop computers, or 3,000 microwave ovens. When shipping that container costs $2,800 more, that cost gets distributed across every product inside. If you have noticed that electronics, clothing, furniture, and appliances have gotten more expensive in the past 6 months and you have been told it is inflation or supply chain issues, what you have actually been experiencing is the Red Sea reroute embedded in retail pricing, and it is not temporary, received. That is announcement number two. Announcement number three, and this is the part almost nobody in Western media is examining correctly. The reroute benefits China's strategic objectives in ways that are profound and largely invisible to casual observers. China is currently constructing and expanding port infrastructure in Pakistan, at Gwadar, in Sri Lanka, at Hambantota, and across East Africa in Djibouti, Tanzania, and Kenya. These ports are marketed as commercial infrastructure, but their strategic function is to create alternative maritime routes that bypass traditional Western-controlled choke points. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which includes the Gwadar port complex, is explicitly designed to provide China with direct access to the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean without transiting the Strait of Malacca, which could be blockaded by the U.S. Navy in a conflict scenario. When Red Sea shipping becomes unreliable, two things happen. First, Chinese exports to Europe reroute around Africa, but Chinese exports to the Middle East and Africa can now flow through alternative ports that China controls. Second, European dependence on long, vulnerable supply chains becomes more apparent, while China's investments in redundant infrastructure look prescient. According to the Financial Times, Chinese container shipping lines have gained approximately 4% additional market share in Asian-European trade since January 2024, largely because Chinese state-owned shipping companies received government subsidies to absorb the increased Cape route costs, while Western competitors raised prices. European importers increasingly book cargo space on Chinese vessels because the rates are lower. Think about the strategic implications. When Western shipping becomes more expensive and less reliable due to a conflict China is not directly involved in, and when Chinese alternatives become more attractive by comparison, that is not an accident. That is structural advantage. Stay with me because this is where the mainstream narrative completely unravels and where the real strategic contest becomes visible. Received? That is announcement number 3. Now let us talk about what is really happening behind the headlines because there are two stories playing out simultaneously and the cable news networks are only covering one of them. This is where honest analysis requires us to examine not just the events, but how those events are being framed and why that framing serves specific interests. The mainstream story is this. Houthi militants in Yemen, backed by Iran, are attacking ships in the Red Sea to protest Israeli military operations in Gaza. The United States and its allies are conducting airstrikes against Houthi positions to protect freedom of navigation. Eventually, through military pressure, the Houthis will be deterred and shipping will return to normal. This narrative appears in nearly identical form across CNN, BBC, Reuters, and most major Western outlets. That is the story being told. Here is the story being ignored. The Houthi movement controls approximately 70% of Yemen's population and most of its major cities, including the capital Sana'a. They have survived 9 years of Saudi-led military intervention, which included a comprehensive naval blockade, more than 25,000 airstrikes documented by the Yemen Data Project, and direct ground combat involving Saudi, Emirati, Sudanese, and Yemeni forces. The Saudi coalition had air superiority, naval superiority, and overwhelming advantages in military hardware and funding. Despite this, the Houthi governance structure did not collapse. Their territorial control expanded. Their military capabilities became more sophisticated, not less. Let me be specific about what 9 years of bombardment accomplished. According to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the conflict has resulted in an estimated 377,000 deaths through direct and indirect impacts. Saudi Arabia spent an estimated $200 billion on the intervention. The UAE deployed ground forces and suffered significant casualties before scaling back its involvement. And at the end of all that expenditure, all that firepower, all that international support, the Houthis control more territory today than they did in 2015 when the intervention began. The idea that intermittent American and British airstrikes conducted from naval vessels and aircraft carriers will accomplish what 9 years of sustained, coordinated ground and air Saudi military operations could not accomplish is, to put it generously, strategically incoherent. To put it more accurately, it is political theater designed for domestic consumption, not operational success. And European governments understand this perfectly, which is why their response has been so revealing. France, Germany, Spain, and Italy all declined to participate in the US-led Operation Prosperity Guardian Maritime Security Coalition that was announced with considerable fanfare in December 2023. Instead, they launched a separate European Union naval mission called Operation Aspides in February 2024, which explicitly focuses on defensive measures escorting European-flagged vessels and does not include strikes against Houthi positions in Yemen. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States announces a military coalition to protect international shipping and its closest European allies, members of NATO, countries that participated in military operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria not only refuse to participate but organize an alternative framework that explicitly avoids offensive action. That is not diplomatic nuance. That is not a minor policy disagreement. That is a fundamental verdict on the viability and wisdom of the American approach. The French Ministry of Defense was remarkably candid about this in a statement released in January. They stated that any effective response to the Red Sea situation would require addressing the underlying conflict in Gaza, not military escalation in Yemen. That is diplomatic language for, we do not believe bombing Yemen will solve this problem, and we do not want to be associated with that strategy when it fails. Meanwhile, and this is critical, ships flagged to China, Russia, and several other nations continue transiting the Red Sea with dramatically lower attack rates. According to data compiled by maritime security consultancy Dryad Global and corroborated by Lloyd's List Intelligence, of the 190 plus attacks conducted through April 2024, fewer than 8% targeted vessels with direct Chinese or Russian ownership or flags of convenience linked to those countries. Houthi leadership has stated explicitly that ships carrying cargo to or from Israel or owned by companies with Israeli connections are the primary targets. They have also stated that American and British vessels are targets due to those countries' military operations, but Chinese vessels, Russian vessels, vessels flagged to India, Malaysia, or Turkey, dramatically different risk profiles. The targeting is selective, not indiscriminate. This is not random piracy. This is calibrated pressure applied to specific actors while explicitly allowing others to continue commerce. That is statecraft, not terrorism. And the fact that mainstream coverage rarely makes this distinction tells you something important about whose interest that coverage serves. If you operate a shipping company, if you manage supply chains, if you run a business with logistics exposure to Asian imports, what is happening in the Red Sea is not a terrorism story. It is a cost structure story. It is a strategic realignment story where economic realities are trumping military posturing. And it is permanent until the underlying geopolitical conditions change, which they show absolutely no signs of doing. The silence around these facts in mainstream coverage is not an oversight. When the Wall Street Journal writes about Red Sea disruptions, the framing is almost always about Houthi aggression and the need for stronger military responses. You will rarely find detailed economic analysis of why rerouting has become the rational business decision regardless of military operations. When the New York Times covers this story, the emphasis is on American military readiness and coalition building, not on the fact that the coalition is paper thin and European participation is minimal to non existent. This pattern of coverage serves a specific function. It maintains the illusion that military solutions are viable and that the previous status quo can be restored through sufficient application of force. It avoids the uncomfortable admission that a relatively small, resource-poor movement in one of the world's poorest countries has successfully altered global shipping patterns despite facing the world's most powerful navy. That admission would require asking much harder questions about American military efficacy, about the limits of naval power projection, about whether the strategic assumptions that guided U.S. policy in the Middle East for the past 30 years remain valid. Those are questions that major media outlets, which rely heavily on access to government and military sources, are institutionally disinclined to ask. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, Athens and Sparta, the two dominant powers in the Greek world, went to war. The conflict lasted 27 years. Both sides exhausted themselves militarily and economically. And who won? Neither of them. Macedon, a previously secondary power to the north, rose to dominance while the Greek city-states bled each other to exhaustion. The dynamic was identical. Two established powers locked in a protracted conflict, convinced that victory was achievable, pouring resources into a strategic stalemate. Meanwhile, a third actor, not directly involved in the fighting, quietly built the infrastructure and alliances that would define the next era. The United States is Athens, projecting naval power and conducting military operations it believes will restore the previous order. The Houthi-Iranian axis is Sparta, asymmetric and resilient, imposing costs without seeking decisive battle. And China is Macedon, watching two rivals exhaust themselves while systematically building the ports, the shipping capacity, and the economic relationships that will structure the next phase of global commerce. The parallel is not metaphorical, it is structural. Great powers in relative decline often fail to recognize that the costs they impose on adversaries are simultaneously costs they impose on themselves, and that rising powers benefit from the chaos without needing to participate in it. So, where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1: Diplomatic resolution. A ceasefire agreement in Gaza removes the stated justification for Houthi attacks. Shipping insurance rates gradually normalize. Red Sea traffic resumes over a period of 6 to 12 months. Global supply chains revert to pre-crisis patterns. For this path to occur, you would need a sustainable ceasefire in Gaza that addresses core Palestinian political demands, which would require either significant Israeli policy changes or extraordinary American diplomatic pressure that we have not yet witnessed. You would also need the Houthi movement to voluntarily relinquish a strategic capability they have developed over years and which gives them significant regional leverage. Possible? Yes. Likely in the next 12 months? The data does not support that conclusion. Path 2, permanent reroute. The Cape of Good Hope becomes the new standard route for most Asia Europe trade. Red Sea shipping remains available only for vessels willing to accept elevated insurance costs and risk exposure. Freight costs stabilize at a higher baseline. European supply chains restructure around longer transit times. This path requires no diplomatic breakthroughs. It requires only the continuation of current conditions. Shipping companies have already made the capital investments in rerouting. Insurance markets have already repriced risk. The infrastructure for the Cape route already exists. This is the path of least resistance, and in complex systems, paths of least resistance are usually the ones that materialize. Path 3, escalation and enforcement. The United States commits significant additional military resources to the Red Sea corridor. Sustained strikes against Houthi infrastructure in Yemen, potentially ground operations or a naval blockade of Yemeni ports. Forced restoration of Red Sea shipping through overwhelming military presence. This would work, in the narrow sense that sufficient military force could suppress Houthi capabilities temporarily. The cost would be a major military commitment in yet another Middle Eastern theater, significant casualties, inevitable civilian deaths in Yemen that would generate international condemnation, and the political difficulty of sustaining that operation for years because that is how long it would take. This path exists in theory. Whether it exists in American political reality is a different question. I think we are on path 2, and we have been since February. The shipping companies have already voted with their capital. The insurance markets have already voted with their premiums. The European governments have already voted with their refusal to participate in offensive operations. What you are watching is the slow motion recognition of a fait accompli. But here are the questions I want you to take away. First, how long can European industries remain competitive when their freight costs are structurally 200% higher than they were 18 months ago? Second, at what point do European companies start relocating manufacturing closer to home or to the Americas to avoid the Asia Cape Europe route entirely? Third, when that happens, who benefits from the construction of new factories and infrastructure projects? Tell me in the comments what you think happens next. Tell me if you are seeing these cost increases in your business, your supply chains, your personal expenses. Tell me if you think path 1 is still viable or if we are already locked into path 2. We will keep tracking every development in the Red Sea, the Suez Canal revenues, the shipping data, and the insurance markets. That is what rigorous geopolitical analysis demands. We do this every single day. Subscribe now if you have not already. Share this analysis with everyone trying to understand why prices are rising and why the explanations you're hearing do not quite add up. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next breakdown, and we will see you in the next analysis.